Hi, we continue in Luke 24, taking up in verse 8 today, after the women who've been following Jesus from Galilee have gone to the tomb and not only found the tomb empty and no body there, they've encountered a vision of two men in dazzling clothes who've told them, "Why are you looking for the living amongst the dead? He's not here, but has risen." And if you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit, I really encourage you to do so, where I go over these questions that you see on the right side of the screen to help us enter into our story. I've gone over them a little bit in the video that followed on the first 7 verses, and I'll touch on them again today, but I really encourage you to get grounded in that before we go into the details here. One of the things we've been looking at is the relation between Luke 24 and the other gospel tomb and resurrection stories, and as we saw, there's really very little there they have in common. Only the parts that are in colored, other than black, are the parts that are in common at all, and as I've noted, only the first day of the week is common to all. Mary Magdalene is interestingly in Mark, Matthew, and John here, although she's named in the part that's omitted here, but not named at the beginning. But what's interesting, I think, today is that Luke and John have in common Peter going to the tomb after he's heard a report from the women, stooping over, not seeing anything except the linen wrappings, and then leaving. And so whatever the connection there is between Luke and John, I won't speculate as some scholars do about sources, but there certainly is a common story tradition there, although Luke uses it differently in his narrative context than John does, because John will have the follow-up in chapter 21 of Jesus asking Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" and telling him to feed and tend for his sheep. So there will be differences in outcome, but there certainly is an interesting parallel there with Peter. We've also been looking at how Luke shapes his story unique to his choice of what he's reporting. So the beginning and the end here in 24, 1 to 12, as we began to look at last time, is parallel to the end in 24, 36 to 53, both by the use of words that are only in these places, terrified here, and the word for disbelieve, which is in both places, but also the thematic element of being told, whether by the two men here or by the risen Jesus here, to remember, either to remember the word of Jesus that he told earlier, or to remember the word of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms there, and be transformed by that. And that's what we'll see happens, sort of, in both situations. And in the center is the Road to Emmaus story, with a nice tight chiasm all the way A through F here, really making Luke's portrayal unique to Luke. And so we'll be seeing how what Luke has done is really not synoptic anymore. It's really directly connected with his own story. And that's also emphasized by how the beginning and the end match. Again, I noted in the introductory video, we saw last time, I didn't have this chart up last time, so if you watched the last video, you didn't see this chart, of these various connections here on the left side with our current chapter, and here back to chapter 1 and 2, with the one exception here in chapter 3, verse 8. And today, we're going to see the Marys connected, and we're also going to see Peter amazed at what happened, parallel to those amazed at what happened back when the shepherds gave their report earlier. So one of the things that Luke is doing is not only framing his whole story, but he's also showing how the expectations and hopes for how God would redeem Israel through the sending of a Messiah in the beginning are transformed by the time we get to here, obviously by the death and resurrection of Jesus. So let's return to our key words and have our immediate passage up here. And as I noted last time, the words in bold and black here are words that are either unique in this one place or rare and only one other place. So this word, excuse the typo there, is only one other place in 1724. And the word leros that we'll see here for the idle tale is only here. And so we start in verse 8. So note that the two men speaking in one voice, just as the women will speak in one voice, do not give any commission. And different scholars interpret that differently. Some have suggested it's denigrating the women because they're not told to be apostles. In other words, they're not told they're not sent back with the message. But others have suggested that they don't need to be doing that. In other words, their purpose is not to be messengers to inform the men where it's really important, but their receiving of the experience and the message is complete in itself. And notice that what we heard last time is the two men say, "Remember how we told you." Whether that's just the women or all of them, but it's certainly not you and the others. It's directed to you, and then they remembered, as we're going to look at in our scene today. So the story of the women is complete in itself, and as we'll see, it's a great long story, relatively speaking, compared to Peter's story, which is just one verse here. And as we'll see momentarily, this is one of the rare places where it's literally women versus men. The women all go as a group, we're told, all the women who came from Galilee there, and then we'll see it being told to all the others. So let's begin to enter into it. So we see in verse 8 here, my note, this is not told whether they believed, as with Peter in verse 12, where that's where the disbelieving is that we can see there. Actually, the disbelieving is elsewhere. He just says he's amazed. It doesn't say anything about his belief. So this is consistent there. So it doesn't say whether they believed, but it does say they remembered his words. And the fact that they go back and tell certainly seems to suggest an element of faith, even if that's not noted. I want to highlight the utter solidarity of what's going on here. If I go back a few verses up so we can see where they were at the end of chapter 23, they're all as a group. The women who had come with them from Galilee, they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. They returned and prepared the spices. They rested. So they're all a group in solidarity as women, as you could see on the cover picture, which I can show you again here now, of a group of women in solidarity going over the hills on their own. They're with Jesus, but they obviously don't need the men. And it's not that they've been commissioned to doing this. The men could have come, but the women come. And all the experiences as a group. So as we saw last time, they found the stone, and they went in, and they were perplexed, and all the verbs apply to all of them. So that's the context we get in here, where they collectively remembered his words, calling us back to the previous remembering in 22:61. Literally, the words here is not logoi for the literal words, but sayings, rematon here, his sayings. And that really puts it in the sense of Scripture, in the sense it's not just individual words, but sayings suggest there's meaning to it. And so they're remembering the meaning, even though we don't hear that. It's simply what he's told them here, that this is what would have to happen. The human would be handed over to sinners, crucified, on the third day rise. So from that situation, as my note below has, there's no anticipation of experience in the risen one, but simply a word that he's risen. Returning from the tomb. It's not clear at all where they're returning to, just as the bad translation here that has it Peter went home, it doesn't say home there, it just simply says he departed. It's not clear where they're going. If we recall, they entered Jerusalem as strangers, and they were told that there was a room, an upper room prepared for them in some secret way that Jesus knew about, but the rest of them didn't know about, and sure enough, so it was. But that seemed to be a room just for the pilgrimage at Passover, as far as we can tell. So with Passover, is it over now? Well, not quite. It just began, and it's 8 days long. So are they all staying in that room? The 11 men and however many women there are and others? It seems unlikely that a group of 20 or 30 or more people could all be in one place. But we don't know where they are at all. And that will continue into Acts, where we'll see the famous scene in Acts 2, where they're all gathered in one place. But it's still not clear where they are. They're not at home in Jerusalem, though their home will be witnessing to Jesus wherever the Spirit leads them. And that, of course, will be the story in Acts. So at least they're returning from the tomb, but we're not told where. The word for returning here, the verb hypostrepho, is 21 times in Luke, but it's here again in verse 33 and in 52 about returning to Jerusalem. So notice what's being expressed here by the narrator. They told this, using the standard word for telling, to the 11. This is the first time we're hearing about 11, but parallel to Matthew, and only Luke will make a point of filling the 12 by lot in Acts chapter 1 and 2, as we'll see from my note below, when Mattathias joins and they refill the number of 12. But to the 11, and all the rest, or all the others, tois loipois. And we've seen that word used for others. It's certainly not a denigrating word, it's just simply to say to complete the unit of all the people in the category. So the 11 here are not referred to as apostles explicitly, although it certainly seems to be who's referred to in verse 10, but simply as the 11, not the 11 apostles, but simply the 11, and all the others. How many of those others are? We don't know. There could be a whole group of disciples. Remember, back earlier in the journey, he sent out 70 to bring the good news to towns. So there were 70 then, plus the 11. So who knows how many there were? And the group of women, again, we don't know how many there are. And what we hear in verse 10 doesn't help us to know how many there are conveying this out. So let's see what happens when we get to verse 10, that Luke has saved it for suspense reasons here, not telling us at the beginning here. Now it was Mary Magdalene, who we heard about earlier. Some have suggested that it's critical of her and denigrating of her to say that 7 demons were expelled from her, as we heard back in chapter 8. But I would argue exactly the opposite, to say that she was suffering from something that was no fault of her own, and she came to Jesus and was healed for it. So that puts her in the same category, I would suggest, with people like Mary and Martha, who were among the women that who are closely associated with Jesus, as well as the woman who anointed him in the house of Simon the leper in chapter 7. So Mary Magdalene, Joanna, who we heard about in chapter 8, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them. So let's look for a moment at comparing groups of women among the Gospels. So we can see here that Luke is the only one who has groups of women throughout the Gospels. Matthew and Mark only have women together at the cross, as does John, other than Mary and Martha, which is also common to Luke and John, although in very different ways. Mary and Martha in Luke is about the issue of Mary sitting at Jesus' feet, while Martha is anxiously trying to get Jesus to tell her to conform to her anxiety and do the work. Whereas in John's Gospel, they're wealthy homeowners whose brother Lazarus has died, and they call upon Jesus to do something for him. So it's the same names, but very different characters in a very different context. But they both do have that. But only Luke has the women at the very beginning, Mary and Elizabeth, of course, and then the ones we've had mentioned here. And then, as we saw at the cross, we're using the same phrase, the women who had followed him from Galilee, and we hear that again now, the women who had come from Galilee, naming this. So we note that Mary, the mother of James, was named in Mark, and she's named in Matthew, but not named in John, but there they are. So then we hear about other women. And who were those? Maybe it's Salome, who Mark adds, as you can see here, but we don't know. Matthew has the mother of the sons of Zebedee, which is a backward way to put it, to name the father that way indirectly, but there it is. We don't know her name. But it certainly seems there are many other women. And in Acts of the Apostles, there'll be other women joined to the group who have not been following Jesus from Galilee, such as Priscilla, who's with Aquila, and then Lydia, as we'll see also. So they told us now to the apostles, and that's, I'd suggest, not different than the 11. There's no basis for hearing that as different, but this is the last time the apostles are named in Luke, 28 times in Acts, though, and that will be key there. What might the author be intending by separating out the 11 here from apostles? Well, maybe it's not that apostles have a particular amount of authority. Peter is certainly one of those apostles, but let's see what happens when the women bring the story to the men, and we see what the men's response is. Curiously, the Greek starts with the phrase kai ephandosen anopian, which is to say something and shined before them, but it's not in any translation. I could not find anything on that. Perhaps it's a manuscript issue, but I could not find anything on that. So if you know anything about that, let me know or put it in the comments, please. But the words to them seemed an idle tale. An idle tale is actually a very calm translation for something that's much stronger, the word leros, only here in the New Testament. As Green notes, a word belonging to the medical vocabulary, and he says, quote, denotes the delirium caused by high fever, and thus used here sarcastically, much like the later sense of hysteria coming from the root Latin sense of a wandering uterus. In other words, a typical patriarchal denigration of the words of women as not being trustworthy. And the irony is that Luke is showing not only are the women's words utterly trustworthy, but the men are fools for not believing them. And so it's a very interesting thing in this highly patriarchal culture. The women are showed as faithful, as taking the risk to be at the foot of the cross, taking the risk to be associated with the tomb, taking the risk of running around in public being associated with Jesus and going to tell the tale, and yet the men simply refuse to believe. As Conselman notes down below from an earlier view, he says the verse, quote, expresses the truth that the resurrection cannot be deduced from the idea of messiahship or from the historical life of Jesus, but that it is announced as something new. And I think that's exactly right, and that goes to the questions I was noting here at the beginning of whether the resurrection validates or authorizes any of these titles. And I noted in the introductory video, it simply does not. Resurrection is what it is, and does not relate in the tradition in any way to anybody holding any of those titles or as validation or not. So all we hear is that they don't believe him. We don't hear that they question him. We don't hear that they ask for proof. We hear this great disdainful sense of, what a bunch of nonsense. And we hear they simply don't believe. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. And as I was noting here from, and I'll bring this back up, the words are actually interestingly close, and we'll see that up close. Peter last heard in 22:61, seen remembering the words of the Lord. So notice he becomes a character right after the women are told to remember how he told you, and they did remember, and reminding us that the last thing we heard about him was remembering the words there, that he would betray him 3 times before the cock crowed. So that was the last word there. And an interesting thing about Peter is, if we didn't have the presuppositions, whether as Catholics or from Matthew's Gospel, about the role of Peter, from Luke's Gospel, we would not necessarily sense that Peter had any particular authority. Here he goes out by himself, and that's certainly a boldness there. But let's look at Simon Peter in Luke for a moment and see. The yellow is when it's Simon alone. The orange is when it's Simon Peter, and the pink or red is where it's Peter alone. Peter being the nickname, meaning rock, that Jesus gave him, although it's not in that kind of order. Here we see it's Simon Peter before he's named him that, and then it's named other times. So we've seen him a number of times, but he's not done anything special. At the Transfiguration, it's good for us to be here and that kind of thing, but there's no sense of you are the rock, and on this rock I build my church. There's no sense at the question of confession here. Who do you say that I am? The Messiah of God, in chapter 9, that he's commissioned or blessed in any special way with that answer. So there's nothing in particular other than that he's associated sometimes with John, as you can see down here, and occasionally with James and John, as we saw back up here. But why are James and John not considered special if Peter's considered special? So especially given that in the Passion story, the person he's most closely associated with is Judas, as someone who betrays Jesus. He doesn't turn him over, but he certainly denies him when witnesses what's called for. So there's no presupposition we should have as we get to this point to think, oh, well, Peter's special, Jesus founding the church on him. Not according to Luke, he's not. But Peter got up using the resurrection, one of the 2 resurrection verbs, on a stemi here, so that may well suggest that it's not just a physically getting up. We had no reason to think he was sitting down, nor why do we need to know what his physical position was. So it certainly seems to suggest he's being reanimated. He's rising from his lethargy or depression or whatever, although none of that's named, and ran to the tomb. And the running certainly makes that connection with somebody who has more energy, and it's similar, as we see here, to where they ran here. He ran with the beloved disciple. You can see running in John's Gospel, but here there is no beloved disciple. That's a function of John's Gospel. And he runs to the tomb by himself, using a rare word here, parakupsos, stooping and looking. It's one word, and it's twice in John 20. So once Peter does it, and once Mary Magdalene does it upon her return. So that certainly connects Luke with John, but Luke's version is so much streamed down from what we saw in Simon Peter's, where he sees the cloth, but various things elsewhere that we don't see here. So stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloth here, the athonia here, again connecting with John's Gospel, by themselves, are alone. What that suggests here isn't 100% clear. It's in John's Gospel, it's separate from the face cloth. Some have suggested that means that somebody else did it, or that Jesus had the time to fold them up, although it doesn't say they're folded, it just says they're by themselves. It's not clear what it's in contrast to, by themselves compared to what. But there we have it. And not that he went home, but simply that he departed, because they have no home in Jerusalem. And all we hear is that he's amazed. And the word thaumazoon 13 times in Luke, but again, as I know, parallel to the beginning of the story, and we'll see one more, does not suggest faith or lack of faith. It just really shows, wow, that was really something. So after the women have gone to the tomb and they've remembered, and Peter has gone to the tomb and been amazed, we've still not seen a risen Jesus, and we've still not seen that they believe all the things that have happened, using the standard verb gidomai, but using it 12 times in the chapter and 10 times from here forward. There's a lot of discussion about the things that have happened, especially as we'll follow in verse 13, when 2 disciples, one named and one not, leave Jerusalem and begin the walk to Emmaus, trying to figure out what happened. That's where we'll pick up next time. See you then.